welcome. Thank you for coming here to the presentation entitled TDD at the architectural level with consumer-driven contracts. Before we go to the main topic, let me say a few words about myself. So my name is Marcin, Grzejszczak, as I mentioned, and I'm working at the Spring Cloud team. So maybe a couple of questions first. Who knows Pivotal? Pivotal? Okay, quite a few people. So we are the small startup that does Spring. Who is using Spring? Okay, most people, okay. Now, I'm working on the Spring Cloud team. Spring Cloud bases on Spring Boot. So who is using Spring Boot? Very good, quite a few people. And last but not least, who's using Spring Cloud? Okay, not that many people. That should change, hopefully, after this presentation. So I'm working mostly on those three things, so Spring Cloud Sleuth. I think last year, I've done a talk here where I've mentioned that already, or like the distributed tracing thing. Spring Cloud Contract is the thing that we're going to talk about today, and the new thing that I've done is Spring Cloud Pipelines. So if you're a fan of continuous delivery, deployment, pipelines, and you hate doing pipelines yourself, you can have them out of the box. My Twitter handle is @Grzejszczak, which for most people is impossible to pronounce or type. So you can go to my blog, toomuchcoding.com, and over there find my Twitter handle. That's the easiest thing. Okay, this is, I think, the world's simplest agenda, because there's going to be an introduction, a demo, and a summary, like in school. So now, may I have your attention, please? This is going to be very important, because there were some storm on Twitter about consumer-driven contracts, about contracts as such. So what they are and what they are not. So what are we not going to talk about? So basically, these things, so schemas, WSDLs, ESBs, XSDs, XSLTs, any sort of things like that, we will not talk about them, because the idea of Spring Cloud Contract and consumer-driven contracts is not to introduce unnecessary coupling or especially replicate old mistakes. I mean, maybe it doesn't seem so, but we're not stupid. So if something didn't work, we don't want to reinvent it again. It's not the case here. So let's start with definition. Let's define some common terms so that we understand each other when I'm going to use those terms. A producer. A producer is a service that exposes an API or sends a message. So API in terms of HTTP, message in terms of messaging. That's the producer. So a consumer, as you can imagine, is a service that consumes the API of the producer or listens to a message from the producer. So if you send an HTTP message to another service, you are consuming that service's API, right? You're a consumer, the other service is a producer. Now, what is a contract? And now I'm going to use, for the last time, the word schema. Contract is not a schema. What it is, it's an agreement between the producer and consumer on how the API message will look like. But it's more scenario-based. So if a message actually, if you send an HTTP message with some body, and that body on the producer side can have 200 fields, we don't care, because in the scenario, we are using only 3, for example. So it's not a schema. We don't represent every single field. We're going to see that later during the demo. So what are consumer-driven contracts? It's an approach where the consumer drives the changes of the API of the producer. Because what typically happens is that the producer side says, this is my API, take it or don't use it, right? And the consumers are not happy because the API is useless. So how we can fix that? Using consumer-driven contracts approach, and I'm going to talk about that later and show you that during the demo. So whenever you hear a new approach, whenever you see a new tool or something like that, the first thing you should always ask is, what problems are we trying to solve? Or do I even have the problem that the tool is trying to solve? Because sometimes what architects are doing is that they find a new tool somewhere, they heard about it, and suddenly they enforce it into an organization. And instead of solving a problem, they have yet another problem, right? The new tool. So consumer-driven contracts, I think they are on Martin Farley's blog, There is an article about this already 10 years ago, if I'm not mistaken. So it's nothing new. And the problems that we're trying to solve are stub validity and reusability in the integration tests, where integration tests, I mean tests that are executed during the build time that, for example, access the database or like in memory one, or send a request to a fake HTTP server. These are integration tests. And the second thing is nice API creation. Okay, so let's get it started. Like, let's go to the crux of the matter. Typical situation. You have a consumer that is sending a request to the producer. I think most of your systems look like this. I mean, this is your production, but on a bigger scale. So, who's doing TDD? Always doing TDD, of course, everybody. You have never started with production code, right? Very good. So, how would you write a test for it? One approach is you have a consumer and you deploy the producer. So you have two standalone apps and you perform end-to-end tests. Is it bad? No, not at all. The problem is the feedback cycle. It's going to take time to boot up both things. If you're sending real requests, most likely this guy is calling 5 other guys. You have to boot them up as well. So it takes time. It's more problematic. It's more error-prone, right? You can, of course, do it, but remember about the feedback cycle. The feedback is going to be later on in comparison to some like unit tests or something. Speaking of which, what you can do is you can call a stub, right? So when, for example, you have unit tests and you're accessing some interface that afterwards its implementation is calling the database, what you often do is use, for example, Mockito, you mock the thing, and you have feedback, right? So why not do the same with HTTP, right? Let's check it out. So let us assume that this is the code of the consumer side, some pivotal calculator service thing. And under a certain folder, we have stubs. So the consumer owns the stub definitions of the producer, right? Because the consumer is calling the producer. So the consumer says, if I shoot your request, you're going to respond me like this, like with Mockito. This is the JSON format of a wiremock HTTP server stub. Who knows wiremock? Wiremock? Quite a few people. Wiremock is an implementation of an HTTP server stub. So basically, you can, with a JSON, define something like this. And there you have, like, if a request with a method post is sent to URL history, then the response with status 201 and content type application JSON should be sent back, right? If you send me such a request, I will send you such a response. Another example, can you even see that? Or not really? Okay, kind of. We're going to see that later during the demo as well. Another example, if you send a request with a method put to URL history, and the body contains 5 plus 5, then the response should be status 200. Oh, and this is nice. Embedding a JSON in a JSON, right? You have to escape all of this. You return a body result 10, count 42. And header is application JSON. This is exactly the way with Mockito, right? Given somebody executes a method of an interface, for example, with such arguments, then return something, right? Last example, oh, this is big, you'll see something. So you have a request. If somebody sends a request, method post to URL history, and body contains 6 plus 6, then respond with 400. That way we can check different scenarios, right? Like error cases, like everything. So now let us assume that we're introducing a new endpoint. What does it mean? Let's say we as consumers got a phone call from the producer team and they said, hey, we've got a brand new shiny endpoint, which is like if you post, send a message with a method post to URL, some non-existent URL, the name is not accidental, then you will receive status 201 and headers content type application JSON. Okay, so you believe them, you type it up in your system, right? You write the missing code to work with the new URL, you write the feature. Your unit and integration tests pass because you wrote the stub and you're saying that if I shoot there, I will have a response, right? And now you deploy to an environment where real integration will take place, right? You deploy the app. And obviously, you have nothing to worry because the build is green, right? Your integration and unit tests have passed. What can go wrong? Everything can go wrong. And most likely it will. Why? Because the stubs that are used in the build phase have nothing to do with the real API. I mean, somebody told me that there is such an endpoint, but maybe he lied to me, or he was mistaken, or maybe the URL was wrong, right? So what happened in the test is that my consumer app sent a request to a stub, and the stub said, okay, and there are unicorns because I created the stub as a consumer, right? And then I deployed it to some environment. The consumer is sending the request, and the producer says, what? There is no such endpoint. That's because the stubs reside on the consumer side. Another example with messaging. Let's say that we have a producer app that sends a message, right? So here we say in the test, if you send a message to topic bar, then the consumer listens to that topic and the world is beautiful. But in the reality, the producer might be sending the message to topic foo, and you're listening to topic bar. And I mean, it's not going to happen. Like, you're listening to a topic that nobody sends messages to, right? Another example is what happens often is that during the tests over here, as a consumer, you're sending a message using the same class that you use for deserialization. So if you have, for example, a typo in your class that you're using on the consumer side, you send a message with a typo already, and you will properly deserialize it. Whereas in the reality, there's no typo, right? So the problem here that I'm trying to show you is that stubs reside with the consumer. This is the first thing. The consumer controls the stubbing process. The consumer can write whatever stupid thing it wants. So how can you ensure that the stubs are still valid? What if other teams want to reuse those stubs? Right now, like, we're in the microservice hype, and mostly, like, if any company is trying to go towards microservice architecture, they're most likely in a situation where they have the big monolith, and maybe something is cut out, or new features were created in microservices around. So basically, you have a sun-like architecture. So everything around is talking to the monolith, right? So every single microservice has to redo the same work of stubbing the monolith, right? So this is the first problem. In one of the companies that I worked for, there was a situation where one of the teams has created a lot of those stubs, and they didn't want to share them because they said that they don't have time to share it, right, between the teams. So another team had to do exactly the same work. And the problem is that the moment they wrote the stubs, they are already outdated because the monolith could have changed in the meantime. The same thing results with messaging. How are you sure you're listening to the proper topic or queue? Or are you sure you're deserialized your message properly? Another thing, nice API creation. So a consumer is called a consumer because it consumes, right? Makes sense. So if the consumer is the one that is consuming the API, it knows exactly how the API should look like to serve its purpose. Often you have a UI team that has to do a lot of hacking and, you know, slashing around to create that request that the producer side wants. And it shouldn't be like that, because it's the consumer that consumes the API. So consumers should take part in the creation of the API. And the producer's API change should be driven by consumer, right? If the consumer has a new need, they should drive the change. If you do not cooperate, things like this can happen. So obviously, unit tests here pass, right? If you use one of those, it's working. But if you do an integration test, I mean, you have to be very slim to fit here. Another example, like, I thought that you're sending me a message with a JSON field, I don't know, name, and you're sending second name. Whoops, I mean, yeah, things happen. Actually, one of the companies, you know the Boy Scout rule? That whenever you go to the code, you should find out, oh, there is a small thing I want to fix, I should fix it, the world's going to be a better place, and world peace, right? So what happened is that this young developer went to the code and saw a typo in the API. So he fixed it. And I mean, he could have picked a better place than the API, that every single consumer had this typo in. on their side, right? So when we deployed the code again, there was disaster. Like every single consumer was broken because they had the typo on their side. So yeah, this is the case with the typo. So potential answer to all of those problems is Spring Cloud Contract. There are other tools related to consumer-driven contracts, for example, Pact. But I would like to show you Spring Cloud Contract because I basically do this. That makes sense. And yeah, so the best way to show it is do a demo. So we're going to code a business scenario. Last year, I've done a brewery app here, I think. And this time, there's going to be also beer. So the consumer app is a service that gets beer requests. We can say it's a bartender. So somebody comes and says, I want a beer. So the consumer, like, we're in microservice world, right? We are doing one thing and one thing only. So the bartender can give the beer, but the bartender doesn't know if the person can get the beer. He doesn't know the legislation in the country, so he has to ask a producer, like his manager, for example, hey, can he get the beer? So the producer checks if the client is old enough to buy the beer, and the feature is that if the user is too young, the beer will not be sold, and otherwise the beer will be granted. And now, for simplicity's sake, let us assume that if you're over 20, inclusive, you're going to get the beer, because it's simpler to write a regular expression, okay? So let's keep it like this. So diagram, hey, I'm 22, give me a beer. The question is, say, can he get the beer? So the answer is yes, and we say, there you go, like in real life. This is actually more like in real life. So I'm 17, give me a beer. Can he get the beer? No, get lost. So this is what happens. Now, important thing, whenever you see a black terminal or black IDE, I'm on the consumer side, a consumer, black consumer. Whenever white terminal or white IDE, I'm on the producer side. I've been doing this talk a lot of times. This is the best way that I found out to differentiate those two. I could have two laptops, but it's hard to do it. So let's do it with colors. Okay, time for the demo. Let's pray to the demo god. Okie dokie. So, can you hear it? Can you hear it? Can you see it? Can you hear the code? So basically, we're on the consumer side, and as I mentioned, consumer-driven contracts are like TDD on the architecture level. So, as purists, we start with a test. We have two tests. Should give me a beer when I'm old enough, and should reject a beer when I'm too young. Obviously, I could write everything from scratch, but I would make a lot of mistakes, so I have some skeleton of the tests. So we have, and already some implementation, so I lied to you, I had something before. So let's say that we have a controller that listens, it's like a post method, listens to the URL beer, and we have application JSON, right? The request body is a person that can have a name and an age. Let's assume such a case. So what we're going to do is I would normally write it, but I'm going to copy paste it because for sure I would make mistakes. I'm going to paste some code that will, using mock MVC, run our tests. So it's exactly what I've presented in the slides. So if we send a post method to the URL beer with application JSON, and we're sending the person thing with age 22. I should actually do 29, but let's do 22. Then what we get back is status 200 and content, like there you go. And another thing that we're going to do is implement the second test. So if I'm 17, I should get what? Get lost. So let's run it. Who thinks that it's going to pass? I mean TDD, right? So obviously it should fail. Hopefully it will. Please fail. Yes. So what we're going to get is like we expected, there you go, but we have nothing because I didn't write anything. Makes sense, right? So red, green refactor, let's try to make it green. So the request came here and we returned a null. So right now we should call the producer. But actually, I don't even know how the API of the producer should look like. I have no idea yet. So let's try something out. So what I'm going to do right now is, as a consumer, I'm going to the black terminal. I'm going to do the following. Let me go back, consumer side. Oh, let me remove, you shouldn't be seeing that. So what I'm gonna do is I'm going to clone the producer's code. I know what I'm doing, don't worry. I don't believe in the internet during conferences, so I'm gonna do it like from another folder. So right now what I did, I cloned, as a consumer, I cloned the producer code. Sounds bizarre, but believe me, I think I know what I'm doing. So repo, presentations, consumer side. Oh, come on. Oh, demo. Producer local, I guess. Producer local. Okay. What did I just do? Wait a sec. This is strange. Didn't I tell you something about demo gods? Okay. Oh, I'm in the wrong folder. CDC new, sorry. So I'm the consumer side. Okay, and now I'm going to do the Git clone. Git clone. Is it better? Yes. Okay, so now I'm cloning the producer code. Let me open it. New window. Let me check if I'm on the proper branch. Okay. So I'm on the producer side. Let us wait for the dependency to be resolved. On the producer side, there will be no production code whatsoever. That feature is not there. Not at all. If it ever gets resolved, I will be able to continue. But let's wait for IntelliJ to not troll me. Okay. So in the main here, we have producer application. That's it. Nothing else. I mean, there's nothing there. But what is interesting for us is this part. Let me empty. Yeah, we don't want to compact. So I mentioned that a contract is, let's say, an agreement between the consumer and the producer on how the API should look like. So let's take a look at the contracts. Here we have two contracts. One is should grant a beer if old enough, and the other should grant a beer if too young. So we have two scenarios that we want to test. Let's check it out. This is a Groovy file that is statically compiled. So if you hover over this, these are methods, nothing like method missing. The compiler is your friend here. So what we're doing is that we are describing two things. One is a request, and one is the response, right? It's pretty much what you saw with the stub. We have a description. Yeah?
Should it be white? Is it the producer side?
No. As a consumer, I cloned the producer. So I'm on the consumer side. Why do I do this? So I'm going to skip ahead. As a consumer, I want to play around with the API of the producer without even mentioning, like talking to the producer. I want to play around offline. I don't want to bother the producer side asking them, could you please implement a stub of this endpoint? And you're testing it out, and after an hour you say, sorry, I made a mistake. Can you change this field to that field? So right now, you're cloning that as a consumer because you want to play around locally with this. Because it's TDD, right? TDD is about red-green refactor, playing around, making mistakes. So this is the very same thing. But a very good question or remark. So we have a description saying that this contract represents a successful scenario of getting a beer. So given client is old enough, when he applies for a beer, then we'll grant him the beer. So what we're going to do is say that given a method post, if we send a method, that message to URL check, and the headers are content type application JSON, and now this is a cool thing. Who knows Groovy at all, like anything about Groovy? Okay, quite a few people. So for those who don't know, this is a map notation. This is how you can describe a map. A map has, what? Keys and values. Kind of like JSON. JSON has keys and values. So basically you can write here, simulate a JSON using a map. It's much nicer than writing a JSON as text. So I say that if somebody sends a message with name Marcin and age 22, right? If such a request comes in, then I think that the response should be like 200. And here, using the beauty of Groovy, You can do multi-line string. So in Java, you would have to escape all those things, right? But if you're using a multi-line string in Groovy, you can just write like this. So status will be OK. So this is a JSON that I would like to be sent back in the form like as a response. Does it make sense? I'm defining something that I would like to happen, a certain scenario, given some like initial input. So name JSON with name Marcin and age 22. Since I'm sure I'm going to make a mistake, I'm just going to copy this. And in the other case, we have age 17, as far as I remember, and status should be, for example, not OK. This is my assumption. Maybe the API should look like this. Yes, let's keep it simple. Of course, it could be something else, but I'm not prepared for the status to be not 200. So let's keep it 200. But you could do whatever you want, obviously. Now, another thing that is important is that over here in the POM, it works for Gradle as well. We have the Spring Cloud Contract Maven plugin. I'm not going to go into details because we don't have time, but there's a Maven plugin related to Spring Cloud Contract here. And now I'm going to do what you always do with your production code. As a consumer, I went to the cloned producer code, and I'm doing Maven clean install skip tests. Why I am doing skip tests, you're going to see that later when we go to the producer side, when we're the producer. But right now what happened are two things. First one, if we scroll up, you can see that the Maven plugin, the contract Maven plugin was executed, and it converted those two, these two, those two contracts into JSON stubs. So this is the first thing. The contracts were converted into stubs. So if we go back to the code and go to target, we will see the stub in the WireMock format. So you don't have to worry about escaping a JSON. You don't have to worry about writing the stub yourself. We're generating that for you, right? So here, for example, you have a case that if you have a message with a method post sent to URL check, and you have an application JSON content type, this is interesting because we are parsing the body into JSON paths. Because otherwise you would have to do some magical stuff with, with equality checking. I don't want to go into detail. So we are parsing the body into a series of JSON paths. And here we are already escaping the body for you. All the JSON is escaped. So this is one thing. So we have the stubs. The second thing that is done is that the stubs got installed locally in my Maven local, right? So I generated the stubs, and they're installed in my Maven local. So right now, I'm going back to my consumer code to the test, right? And I know what kind of a request I would like to send. Obviously, I would make mistakes, so I'm going to copy this. Oh, let's go back. Let's add some imports. OK. So I'm sending a message with the REST template to URL localhost 8090 to /check. I'm sending the application JSON, and I have the person object that I'm sending, right? I have a name and an age. And what I expect is a response. It will have a field called status, and it can be OK or not OK, right? Simple stuff. So let's run the test. Who thinks that the test will pass? Nobody. Either you're sleeping or you're right. So the thing that is going to happen is we're going to have an extremely terrible exception, which is connection refused. That's because I'm sending a real request, and I didn't do anything about the server. Like, there's nothing running there, right? And now, Spring Cloud Contract magic comes into play. Or maybe one more thing. When I build the stub of the producer, you can see that the group ID is com-example. The artifact ID is beer API producer. The version is 001 snapshot, and classifier is stubs, right? So this is how I, as a consumer, I installed stubs of the producer like this. So right now, I'm using this annotation called autoconfigure stub runner. As you can imagine, stub runner is running stubs. So that is one of the few names that I've created properly, I think. So we're saying work offline, meaning my stubs are in my Maven local. Okay, search for the stubs in my Maven local. And here I say that the service that I'm calling is com example, beer API producer, pick the latest version possible with classifier stubs and run it on port 8090. So right now, if everything works fine, this should work. Please, God. Okay. So what happened is, if we go here to the logs, when the test was started, it was stub runner tried to find the artifact with the stubs in my Maven local. It started a wiremock server on port 8090. He found those stubs and packed them to a temporary file and fed the wiremock with the stubs. Everything happens automatically, right? So take a look at the power that we have currently. So I didn't write a single line of implementation code on the producer side. I played only with the contract, which is just request response. And I can have integration tests, right, against stubs. So I told you that it's about like grid green refactor. Currently we have green. So if I go here and I say, it's kind of stupid that I'm sending my name. Why should I send my name? I mean, the age matters, right? So I'm going to do something else. I don't like the fact that I'm sending single thing. So I'm going to create a class request. I'm removing the name. I don't like it. Okay. The name is gone. Okay, it's gone. And instead of sending the person thing, I'm going to send the request. And person age, right? So right now, I'm sending only the age. I don't like the fact that I'm sending the name. I will rerun the tests. I mean, obviously it should work, right? And it doesn't. Why is that? Because wiremock tells me that the closest match to what I'm sending is the one with the name and the age. Why? Because in the contract, I specifically said that both things have to be there, right? So if you think that, you're talking to somebody or you keep your schemas in Confluence and somebody has forgotten to update, that one of the fields is mandatory or otherwise things will break, here you will have that in your tests. It will break automatically. So what I have to do is go back to my contracts and remove the name because I don't need the name, right? I remove the name and I install the stubs again, right? Because I have to create them again and install them locally again. Let's wait for that. Okay. So I go back to my test code as a consumer. I run it again. And hopefully this time it's going to be better. Okay, that's good. But come to think of it, the stub is very brittle. I mean, I have to fix the age, like 22 or 17. Imagine, with the age, it's kind of simple, right, to fix it. You just create a person with that age. But imagine having a database ID or time, for example, in your stub. That you have to set the clock in your system to send that particular moment in time because the stub requires that particular time. So it makes no sense. So what we can do, like in my test, what I would like to have is that I, for example, send, 89 here. I shouldn't be drinking beer at the time, but who cares? And let's do 12, right? Like this. So what I can do on this side is provide dynamic values. So what I can write here is, this is a method. You can write either value or a dollar. So I'm saying that as a consumer, which I can write also like this, a C for consumer, I want a regular expression, and here comes my knowledge of regex, old enough, so it should be from 2 to 9, and from 0 to 9, right? So 20 plus. If too young, then I write from 0 to 1. I know that it's not kind of very valid, but let's keep it like this. So right now, I'm saying that this value in the JSON can differ. Like it's a dynamic thing, but it has to match this regular expression. So I'm going to run it again, regenerate the stubs locally. Remember that currently we're working all the time offline, which means that I'm playing around with the contracts of the producer without even telling the producer about this. I'm just playing around. I want to check out if my code it makes sense to call them or something like that, right? And right now, if I run the tests again, that should work because it's going to match regular expressions. Boom, and it's working. Great. So as a consumer, what I'm doing right now, I'm saying, okay, I think that this API is good. I wrote some code on my side about this. I contacted the producer side. They said it's okay. Because remember, consumer-driven contract is also about conversation. It's not like suddenly you do a pull request with 200 contracts saying, okay, I've done my part, now it's your turn. No, it doesn't work. You have to talk to them. And they say, okay, we think that the contract is okay. So right now, I'm filing a pull request to the producer side saying, this is the contract that, let's say, suits our needs. Could you implement your side? So right now, we're going to switch IDs, and we're going to switch terminals. So I'm going to the white one, and I'm going to this one. So I'm on the producer side. I'm on a branch called pull request, because it's a pull request. So what you can see here is that I have the stuff that I wrote over here, right? I have the contracts. And now, previously what we did is that we executed as consumers Maven clean install skip tests, right? Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to run clean install. I'm not going to skip tests. So basically, I didn't have a single test apart from one, which is generating documentation, so let's ignore it. I didn't have any tests there, right, on the producer side. And suddenly, some tests failed. I mean, why? Why is it so? So basically, if I go back over here, at runtime, when the plugin was executed, it has done the third thing. It generated tests. So if we go to the REST test, you can see that we have validate should grant a beer if old enough, and validate should reject a beer if too young. So those contracts, those two contracts, were converted into test. So if you're in your contract, you say, if I send a request with a method post to URL check with age matching a regex, then I expect certain response, then actually we are sending that message with header, with body, with age matching a regex. We already create that value for you. We are sending a post method to check, and we are expecting content type application JSON and a response having a field status equal to OK. So if you're not doing that, if you're lying, you're not going to be built. If you're not going to be built, you're not going to create your stubs, you're not going to publish them. So we have a source of truth here. So one more thing, all the generated tests have to extend a base class. Why, you're going to see in a second. Since I have like 10 minutes left, so I have to speed up. On the producer side, as inside the controller, what I have is a service that is checking whether the person can get the beer or not. So actually, to do contract testing, I don't even need an implementation, right? Why is it so? Because I'm going to write here that if person checking service should get beer is true, then I will return response with beer check status OK. This is my positive scenario, that somebody is eligible to get the beer. And now, in the base class, I have an ordinary Mockito code here. So I create a producer controller to which I inject a mock of an interface, and I tell that if you execute that interface with person older than 20, then return true. Why is it so powerful? Because imagine that you're accessing database, sending a request underneath to do all of this verification. In terms of contract tests, we don't care. I don't want to test your implementation. I want to test if we can communicate. right? So let me run the first generated test locally. I'm going to put a breakpoint over here, and I'm going to put a breakpoint over here. So let me run it. This generated test is a JUnit test, so you can just run it from your IDE. Okay, we're here. I'm sending a request. I'm over here. The request was received. The person to check is having age 58. And suddenly I'm in my matcher in the Mockito thing. So Mockito checks if the person is older than 20. If that's the case, let me put another breakpoint over here. I got a response. Can we see something? Okay, I mean, the status is 200. Work. I should have just executed till the end, because now he's thinking. Ridiculous. Let me run it, like, run. So right now the test passes, because my mock said, if you're over 20, you're eligible. So, and what I sent back is status okay, right? Now, if I run both of them, obviously one will fail because I didn't do the second part of the thing. Okay. So here I'm going to do return new response, beer check status not okay. Okay, so let me run both of them, and they both should pass. So right now, as a producer, I've done my part. So semantically, I'm prepared for the requests. It doesn't mean that the feature is working at this point, because what we're talking about is contract testing, whether we can have the conversations on production. So right now, what the producer would do is merge the pull request, right? And the rest I'm going to show you in the slides. So that's the end of the demo. Actually, it worked, to my surprise. So a summary. We had the first phase, so the consumer phase. Oh, sorry. We had the consumer phase. So the consumer was working offline. He was fiddling around with the contract until the consumer was happy. The point of blocking is the contract. So let's say that we have agreed with the producer on the contract. So then the producer could start its phase, implementing the feature. Once that's done, consumer is switching to online. You remember the flag work offline that I done? So then the consumer switches it off and says, hey, the stubs, don't take a look at them like on my Maven local. Take a look at my Nexus or Artifactory, because the stubs are there. So whenever the producer does a breaking change, it goes to Nexus or Artifactory or whatever, you build your app, it's going to break because you download the latest stubs and you weren't prepared for that. So the consumer clones the producer code locally, the producer owns the contracts, there is the interaction working offline, a consumer files a PR. Now the producer takes over the PR, writes the missing implementation, and merges to master. Then the CI tool like Jenkins or Concourse uploads the stubs to Nexus or Artifactory. And then the consumer switches to online mode, and it downloads the stubs of collaborators during the build phase. So now what you can say that I'm crazy because one does not simply clone somebody else's repo. For example, due to security. And you're right. I mean, I'm not crazy, but you're right that sometimes it's impossible. So what you can do is to have a repo with all the contracts. So the contracts do not lay with the producer, but they are in one single place. And then the consumer clones that repo, interacts with that repo offline until it's happy with the API, merges the PR, files the PR to that repo. Then the producer takes over the PR, writes the missing implementation, and once it's done, the PR is merged. And when the producer is built, it uploads the contracts, the stubs to Nexus or Artifactory. Similar stuff. The source of truth is over here instead of lying with every single producer. And if you think, how about create living documentation out of this? You're very right. So if you have this case, you have all the contracts for all the apps in a single place. They are telling you the truth because they are tested against the producers. So you can create an ASCII doctor documentation If you check out the Spring Cloud contract samples, I already do that there, so you can check it out. And you have, like, the BAs can read that. You can do whatever you want with those contracts, right? So that's really, really interesting that you can create a living documentation out of this. Another thing that you can say is that when I said Groovy DSL, you wanted to slap me in the face because you hate Groovy, you hate scripts, you don't want to do it. Fair enough. What you can do is use Spring Cloud contract wiremock with ResDocs. Who knows ResDocs? Nobody knows ResDocs. Okay, so basically, if you're using mock MVC, you can add Spring ResDocs to generate the documentation from your tests. So if you're sending via mock MVC a request, it will automatically be converted into ASCII doc format or Markdown format documentation with curl examples of how to execute that request. And you can publish that somewhere. So you can profit from that and also create stubs from this. And this is how it looks like. So you have a normal mock MVC code, so you have a person to check with age 33. You perform a post, content type, the same thing as you could see, and now you do some additional expectations that status should be okay, and you say that the age is a regular expression thing, and the stub should be put to file called should grant a beard of old enough. So you can do exactly the same thing without the DSL. Summary. So with Spring Cloud contract and consumer-driven contracts, what we've managed to do is that we've created an API that suits the consumer and the producer. Because the consumer played around, contacted the producer, and they said, okay, we like the idea, let's do it. Expectations were defined by readable contracts, so the BAs can read it. You can convert that into documentation afterwards. Expectations were tested against the producer, right? So this is the answer to the problem that how can we be sure that the stubs are still valid? We are, because we are testing against the producer. If it's invalid, the build is going to be broken, the stubs will not be published. Producer stubs can be used by consumers because they are published to Nexus, so everybody can profit from that, right? They are over there, there's one source of truth. Starting and setting stubs is fully automated, you don't have to do it. I mean, just one annotation. So why could you consider using Spring Cloud Contract Verifier? So this is the, like, what's underneath Spring Cloud Contract. You can do the same with messaging. So you can produce, stubs of messages that are tested against the producer. So if you say that you're sending a message to some topic, and that message contains 2 fields, we will check if that's true on the producer side, and on the consumer side, we're going to send you such a thing. It's not, so you have to deserialize it, right? So we get rid of the problem that you're using the same class for sending a message and for deserializing the message. You have clear and easy to use statically typed DSL, which you can optionally use. Automatic generation of tests. So developers are lazy, so we're doing the tests for you. You don't have to do it. You have the stub runner functionality that you can automatically download the stubs and run them. We integrate with Spring Cloud, so basically if you're using any sort of discovery service, you don't need it in the tests. We're stubbing it out completely. You can forget about this. And we integrate with Cloud Foundry. For example, we have a stub runner boot. So all of the stubs that I've mentioned, you can run like a, let's say, in a standalone process. So if you have a UI that you're using, I don't know, writing in Ruby, you have a .NET app somewhere, you can run the stubs with Java jar. And they will be automatically downloaded and run like in a process. So you don't have to, like, it doesn't have to be only done with Java. Okay, so now it's time for the questions. Any questions? Yeah, go ahead.
Does those scenarios support only reg expression? Could it be something, I don't know, more functional?
So the question was whether the dynamic values support only regular expressions, or can it be something more dynamic? Come again? A list? A list of what? Of values. Yeah, no, so currently we would have to convert the list of values to regular expression. Why? Because wiremock underneath, because we're using wiremock underneath, right? It supports only like, JSON paths, and JSON paths support regex. So we are bounded with what the technology underneath allows you to do, right? So for example, we don't support XML yet, And currently, we wouldn't be able to do regular expressions with XML because wiremark underneath doesn't support XPath in version 2, which allows you to do XPath with regular expressions. So you would have to have only static values, right? So currently, like, the answer is no. Any questions?
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
For example, if you have those contracts, they could be using only if you got the consumer and producer in Spring Framework.
So the question is, can those contracts be used only if you have a Spring Framework? No. Why is it so? Because if you have the case with the shared contracts, or not even so, and you are the Ruby guy, right? And you want to, like, the backend is in Java, so to say, and you're on the Ruby side. So what you can do, the only thing that you have to install, and since you're a Java, let's say you're a JavaScript developer, that way you have to install NPM. So if you can install NPM, you can install Maven as well, right? It's not difficult to install Maven. So if you go to the repo with shared contracts, what you can do is basically run maven clean install, skip test, and you will install the stubs locally, and then you can run the server with the stubs, like with Java jar. So you have to know 2 commands to run it, right? The only thing that differs is that you will not be able to profit from the contracts on your side, like as if you were the producer, right? Because we generate Java tests, right? So in that way, it's kind of impossible, right? But you can work with Spring Cloud Contract in the way that you can profit as a consumer if you're using another language. But if you really want to have a technology that is embedded in this polyglot environment, you can check out Pact, because Pact is done for different languages and like a lot of them. I don't know how many, right? So it's possible. You will not profit from that as a producer, but you will profit from that as a consumer, and it's kind of easy to do it.
All right, we got 3 questions in Slido.
Okay.
Maybe do that, like we're short on time, but
okay.
Still. Which tool is generating the tests?
So it's Spring Cloud Contract Maven plugin or Gradle plugin, right? So on the producer side, let me show you that again. So sorry, this is the consumer, the black one, the white one. So if we go to the POM over here, you will see that we have the Spring Cloud Contract Maven plugin. And you say that there are 3 ways of defining the base class, never mind. So basically you define the base classes, and the Spring Cloud Contract Maven plugin will scan your DSLs, your Groovy contracts, and generate the tests from those contracts. So the answer is the plugin.
On producer side, we generated tests. You have a single truth. You have to remember regenerate tests when you change the contract. So what if you forget?
If you forget, you will push the code, your CI will fail. Basically, right? Because it will start Maven clean deploy, right? Or Gradle publish, whatever. The test will be generated, the test sources are there, and it will fail. So there's no way of hacking. Go ahead.
Is this possible to return a value on the response that is passed on the request?
The question is whether I can return a value from the request to the response. No. Because it's not that trivial. You would have to do some hacking that would be with Wiremark, you would have to have some sort of a custom, it's called transformer, I think. I've never tried it, but I think. And you would have to be sure that the transformer is on the consumer side. You would have to tell them, hey, you can use Spring Cloud Contract, but please remember to add an additional transformer or something. So what we suggest, and also on the other hand, it can be problematic from the readability perspective. We prefer to have explicit values, right? So just put whatever you put on the consumer side, put over there, right? Because it's, remember that we don't want to redo the functionality that we have in the contracts, right? So if, for example, we would check that the guy is not eligible for beer if we can do it in 100 different ways, I would assume that we have 2 contracts only, right? He can get the beer or not. Okay, any more questions?
Yeah, there is one more here. Why instead of Gradle you're using Maven?
because more people know Maven. That's why I presented that during the demo. But there's a plugin for Gradle as well. So if you check this out, we have apply plugin Spring Cloud contract, and you have a contracts section. So that's exactly the same. And it generates tests. It's exactly the same. But more people know Maven. That's why I picked Maven for the demo. But you can do both. And actually, since I'm an automation freak, all of what you see. Oh, actually, I should have shown you that in the slide. Oh, but there's no link. So if you check out on GitHub Spring Cloud contract samples, everything that you saw today is there, and I use it for testing Spring Cloud contract. So it's like continuously tested. Okay, so here are some links to our Twitter from Pivotal and Spring, so you can check it out. The PDF is going to be uploaded, so you can click the links here to read the docs, check the samples. If you have any questions, you can go to Gitter. Spring Cloud contract Gitter. Gitter is like a chat for GitHub. And yeah, you can find me somewhere and let's have a chat. Thanks.